This is the Definitely Uncertain podcast, brought to you by Goldrock Capital. Each week, we look at how high net worth families can improve their lives, decisions, and investments in a deeply uncertain world. We always aim to provide practical information, even if we can't offer specific investment advice. This is the Definitely Uncertain podcast. My name is Darren Rockman, and I'm a partner at Goldrock Capital, 21-year-old multifamily office, servicing high net worth families in Israel and around the world. And I am very pleased to welcome my friend and neighbor, Hillel West, to the podcast. Hi, Hillel.
Hey, hi there, Darren.
Hi, great to have you on. Hillel is head of manufacturing and supply at Indivior, which is a London Stock Exchange listed pharmaceuticals company. He was before that for many years a vice president at Teva Pharmaceuticals, where he was focused on their supply chain. And prior to that, he consulted to some of the biggest companies in the world about supply chain solutions, companies like Coca-Cola, Unilever, and Shell. He has a BA in engineering from my alma mater, Monash University, and an MBA from Columbia.
Yes, indeed.
Yes, although we say that I think we were at the university at the same time, but you were in the engineering school and I was in the law school, and there was a very large fence with dogs and lights and barbed wire, making sure that you guys didn't come across.
First of all, engineering people only come out at night. Right? During the day, they're generally hidden under rocks and in dark places.
Right. And for very good reason.
Right.
So, as you can hear, Hillel is a somewhat of an expert, or a real expert in supply chains, and as this has become one of the biggest economic factors around inflation and growth, I thought that it'd be great to have Hillel's perspective on that. So let's start from the beginning. For those who don't know, what is the global supply chain, and how did this come about?
Sure. So thanks for the question, Darren. I think one way to look at global supply chain is, and moving away from sort of the textbook definition, is it's the physical manifestation of globalization in the manufacturing and distribution of products. So, if you think back to the IT revolution of the 90s, with client-server architecture, the cost and speed of data flows, internet connectivity, a lot of other contributing factors were happening to globalization at the same time. Shorter international transit times with sea air and also increased reliability. You had companies that wanted to take advantage of labor cost arbitrage in developing and low-cost countries. You had the greater environmental costs and awareness, and then environmental costs of the West. And maybe one other point was you had this beginning of collaboration between key regulatory bodies. I come from pharmaceuticals, a regulated industry. So this is also true of food, it's true of chemicals. You had the collaboration between these bodies like the FDA and the EMA and Visa in South America. And all of these factors together drove the globalization of manufacturing and distribution networks in the manufacturing industry.
Right. And okay, so why was this done? What have been the benefits of global supply?
Sure. So, the main driver, and continues to be the main driver, has been costs, decreased costs or maintaining costs that have been passed on to the consumer. So, to a large extent, we all have benefited from this move towards globalization and global supply chains. And those costs come from a number of different places. You've got, as I mentioned, the labor costs, taking advantage of those lower labor costs in China. You've also got lower capital costs. So the flow of funds around the globe to support the investment that's made this happen. You've got increased consolidation, which has actually led to lower inventory, lower working capital. And this is key to maybe what we'll talk about a bit later, but since the late 90s, inventory in the US among US businesses has dropped by 20%.
Right.
Now, so costs is the main driver. There's also the tax aspects of it, and taking advantage of favorable tax environments. But there have been some other benefits as well. You've got global standardization of our products. Yeah, the old McDonald's is of course a great example.
Yeah.
You've got something that's been good for the consumer that actually has translated into higher prices is actually been increased regulatory pressures and hurdles. So, you know, if in the pharmaceutical industry, the cost of bringing a product to market has, you know, has doubled over the same time frame. And I suppose that the last benefit, maybe less important to us in the Western world, but important to the social democrats among us, is job opportunities and GDP growth in the developing world.
Right.
Because as the opportunities basically have moved to those areas of low labor cost and allowed those economies to grow and grow significantly, like India and China and Asia in general.
Okay. So we've had, you know, let's call it a 50-year process of increased globalization, which has driven prices down, as you say, supported by low interest rates. And then COVID hits. You know, February 2020. What happens then to global supply networks?
Right. So I think it's important to highlight that one of the other things that has been happening over that same time period and due to the same pressures is global consolidation. And we're not always. I think it's important that as consumers, we're often not aware of the extent to which the global networks are consolidated. Let me give you an example. Pharma in the pharma industry is one. The raw materials, the active ingredients that go into all of our drugs, all of our pharmaceuticals, 70 to 80% of them today are manufactured either in India or in China. Right. And if you go back to the 90s, actually, it was only about 10%.
Right.
So there's been this massive shift, massive consolidation. Almost all pharma now originates in India and China. We've seen a few years ago, China flexed its muscles and showed how dominant it was in rare earths, metals, for instance. But I'll give you some other examples. I mean, that are Western world. Tetra Pak. So, you know, the aseptic packaging, the prisms that became very popular.
How vegan milk comes in, yeah.
Absolutely. The prisms that all of a sudden started appearing in supermarkets around the globe and then very quickly moved to other industries. It's now actually dropped a little, 70 to 75%, but they used to have 85% of the global market. One company.
As a company. So you're saying consolidation, both geographic consolidation and also at the company level, with companies specializing in just becoming huge and dominating their markets.
I want to give one more example because for people from down under, it's maybe close to our hearts and something with it most of us probably aren't aware of. Until recently, with the advent of the company that I work with is involved in treatment for opiate abuse. Right. So this is a sort of an area that's close to my heart as well. 70% of the raw material, the opium poppy, grown for illicit, so for legal production of opiates around the world, whether it be morphine or oxycodone, 70% of it is grown in Tasmania.
Tasmania?
In Tasmania.
Look at that.
And you wondered why those Tasmanians always had a smile on their faces. But so you've got this global consolidation, like you said, not just companies, but entire industries have reached this high degree of regional and also company-based consolidation.
Okay, so that's background to COVID, and then what then happens?
Okay, so an interesting thing when you look at COVID is, I mean, there have been supply chain disruptions, you know, over the last decade, some of which have been very significant. We sort of tend to push those into the back of our memories. You know, we had the Fukushima disaster in 2011. We had the Icelandic volcano eruptions in 2010.
Right.
We had the Eurozone crisis in 2009. I'm going backwards, of course, SARS and bird flu in 2002, Y2K. I mean, look, supply chain disruptions happen. But most of them are geographically concentrated. And I didn't even bring into there the weather-related disruptions. We've had in 2020 and 2020 through 2022 is what I'll call a sort of a combined 1, 2, 3 punch: COVID-19, Brexit, and now the Ukraine war. And that's created some interesting disruptions in global supply chains. And one of the key questions that everyone's asking is this 1, 2, 3 punch a statistical anomaly, or is it the start of things to come?
Right. So is the global integrated global order that's been created now just falling apart? And Ukraine, Russia, oil and gas supplies being cut off, being part of that. Obviously, issues around things like wheat also being part of that, and eggs. I understand that most of Israel's eggs lots of Israel's eggs come from the Ukraine. I didn't know that until recently. Okay, so what industries have now been impacted by these, what you call the 1, 2, 3 punch?
Right, sure. So, I mean, you've always got the consumer-facing industries. So you've got retail, you've got accommodation and fast food, food services, support services, public sector. But I'd say these are the ones that are the fastest to be impacted, but the fastest to recover.
Okay.
Where you get the longer term issues that only...
Why is that? Why are they the fastest to recover?
Because they generally, in many cases, the labor is unskilled.
Right.
And therefore, these are services and services that can be turned off or turned on, ramped up or ramped down relatively easily. And I'm sure there are plenty of retailers who wouldn't want me to say that.
Right. So if I can't source T-shirts in China, I'm going to get them from Indonesia?
That's absolutely right.
Okay.
That's absolutely right. And these are also generally local services,
right.
not affected by this global consolidation that I was mentioning earlier. Where the next group, though, is the group of regulated industries, which are slow to adapt. I mean, if you take pharmaceuticals as an example, which is probably the extreme,
right?
To move a single product between sites,
between manufacturing sites,
is a 2 to 3 year process and takes millions of dollars for a single product.
Right.
Now, obviously, food is not in the same category, but to start moving food manufacture around the world is a slow process. Similarly, also with chemicals. For those same reasons, these are industries which are also affected by economies of scale, and the economies of scale is something which often drives the consolidation.
Right.
And as soon as you've got consolidation, now you've got a pinch point.
Right. So this would include things like car and truck manufacturing. It would include things like medical device manufacturing, chip manufacturing, all those areas.
All those areas, absolutely. In food, I mean, you've got to. This is an area that often people don't understand well enough before either going into an industry or as practitioners in the industry, maybe as investors in the industry. But you've got to understand where the pinch points are. Right. You've got to understand if there's a Tetra Pak upstream who controls 75% of your market. I just learned actually, and we're learning every day. I just learned a few weeks ago that actually 70% of the global label market is actually handled by a single company.
Right.
The largest manufacturer of aluminium foil, which goes on everything. It goes on our food. It is used in the pharmaceuticals. There's one manufacturer in the world that holds over 50% of the market. Right. By the way, just so that everybody knows, they just notified all their customers that their previous order lead time of 60 days has now been increased to 300, effective immediately.
300.
300.
Wow.
Effective immediately. And that's because they're suffering from the impacts of COVID, whether it be increased demand, transport, raw materials, and so on. And so they're now passing that on to their customers.
So we're all going to be licking the back of labels now instead of being able to just peel them. Wow. Okay. So you're describing a very large part of the global economy where these disruptions are having what seems to be very long-term effects. So how long does it take, or how long do we think it's going to take for these to get resolved? Because obviously, if cost was the reason that the global supply chain was invented, then as it's being uninvented or is sort of crumbling in various ways, shapes, and forms, that means costs are going up, which is one of the great drivers, or maybe the great driver, inflation. So the question of how quickly that comes in under control becomes really important.
Right. Look, most of the estimates talk about 6+ months. I would probably say 9 to 12. And I'd say 9 to 12 only because what we're starting to see is now the impacts on stages that are further up the supply chain, which will take time to flush through. I think the good news is, even though in order to resolve some of the capacity issues, capacity expansion is something which can take many months, even years. I think the good news is that a lot of the large companies have been expanding capacity over the last 12 months during the COVID period. Now, unfortunately, that creates an interesting question as to whether or not we're going to see, basically a boom bust cycle for
Too much supply.
Too much supply, or at least too much capacity, which we then all have to pay for as consumers.
Right.
Some of the things will go away quickly. I mean, at the moment, for instance, just as an example, air freight. I don't know if everybody realizes air freight at the moment, spot prices on air freight have tripled since before COVID. Now, if your product is, usually got about 10% of its cost, in 10 to 15 in distribution and transportation, all of a sudden that factor is now multiple. That cost is now triple. And that's eating away into the profits. That's of course
forcing prices to be pushed up.
All forcing prices, and that's of course what's driving some of the inflation.
Right. So you describe now an increase in supply, or in capacity, I should say. What other structural changes have been forced on the supply chain by these three events?
Right. Every time there's been a major supply chain disruption, like the ones I mentioned in the past, and again now,
ones that you lived through,
at least the ones I've lived through, there's been this question about: is there going to be more localization? Is there going to be? Are we going to move away from the globalization? Are we going to see more local manufacture? Global supply chains breaking up into regional and then local chains. Certain countries have had, over the last 15, 20 years, have had localization laws. Mexico, Brazil, Russia. And the experience there has been service is not improved, and it just drives up costs.
Right.
So every time there's been a disruption up until now, the answer's been no, there isn't going to be major structural changes in the global supply chain. And I think that's going to be the case here. Quite honestly, the price pressure, the cost pressure, and the pressure for profit is just too strong for there to be major changes. On the other hand, what I would expect to see is increased investment in redundancy. Right. So let's be prepared with a small plant that's local in case something goes wrong, but most of my manufacturer still sits offshore.
How does that help though? If I'm producing 100 of something and that supply gets cut off, what does it help that I can produce 5 or 10 of it locally?
Because you can at least choose your highest importance, highest profitability products and manufacture those at that site.
Customers, I assume.
And customers, fair enough. And in that way, at least protect the profitability, the long-term future of the company.
So it's a triage. It's a Band-Aid.
Yeah. So I think that's something we'll see, that increased investment. We will see increased investment in inventories. But what's going to be interesting is how does that happen? What's the trade-off? What does that do to cost in a period of increasing inflation?
Right. We're already seeing some of that in what's happened in the logistics real estate sector, where which I'm sure you're seeing as well, where massive demand for logistics, both from companies and from investors. I was recently speaking to a fund that invests in logistics, and they were saying that they are increasing rents on rent rolls by 30% because there is just such incredible demand for, they're in the last mile. Are you seeing that also impact costs?
Absolutely. So, I mean, there are a couple of things here. You've got first of all the finished goods manufacturer who wants to hold more, so he's got buffers of inventory so that to ensure continuity of supply and out into the market. I gave the example before of that increased lead time. If now it's going to take almost a year to get your raw materials versus what was previously less than 2 months, you've now got to hold an extra 10 months of raw materials somewhere, accessible to the plant. And so through all stages in the supply chain, you're going to see companies whether to buffer or to because of upsets upstream, requiring these additional warehousing and logistics services.
And that's additional cost because someone's got to pay the interest on that inventory, right?
Absolutely. Look, the other thing that's happening is so that's the warehousing, and there's also the physical movement.
Right.
As soon as they shut down airspace, basically over the Ukraine, Russia's shut down airspace over Russia to all US, European, British, and Canadian flights. As soon as that happens,
everybody, basically,
pretty much, except for the Chinese. As soon as that happens, then that places additional pressure, on alternate routes, and basically then the price of all of the routes goes up.
Right.
Or secondly, alternate methods of transportation. So sea goes up. So then all the lead times also start to extend there. It used to take 2 days to book a flight for international freight. It now takes about 7.
Right. So these types of disruptions often generate changes in the way people do business and also changes in technology. Are you starting to see the fruits of technological change and revolution that happened in the supply chain industry? It's an area you're obviously very involved in.
I haven't actually seen. There actually has been relatively little change in the systems that enable us to manage global supply chains. I think one area which will get a boost out of this is global traceability. So
Right.
the whole idea of
or in other words, where the hell is my stuff?
Where the hell is my stuff? Exactly. So there are those capabilities today. Where basically on every pallet or in every carton, you can put a small transmitter and know where your product is around the globe at any place in time. And I think that is technology which will get a boost. Less so, less so at the corporate, less so at the corporate, larger enterprise application.
Right. What about delivery?
So I think if these shocks had happened in 2 years' time, we'd be much closer to unmanned delivery of goods and services. I think we'd be closer to drone delivery of goods and services. Unfortunately, we're not there yet, and I would expect that. I think they'll probably get a boost. Maybe this will act as an accelerator, but I don't see this really changing the mode of delivery.
Right.
That we can expect to see.
Okay. And then sort of to round off, when it comes to investors, what are the lessons learned or maybe the opportunities that are presenting themselves for investors, given the changes that have happened and given how impactful this has all been?
Right. Look, I think one of the key points for investors is definitely to understand the consolidation, the upstream and downstream consolidation in the industry. And I mean, over the last 20 years, especially in consumer goods and in manufactured products, understanding where those pinch points are. Now, those pinch points are opportunities. A lot of them are private companies holding 50, 40 to 80% of market share, basically within their segment. So they create some very interesting long-term opportunities. Somehow they've managed to continue to acquire and get under the anti-monopoly laws and around the globe, and I mean, create some very interesting opportunities. I think we have to be very careful what happens in the next couple of years with these boom bust cycles around companies basically building additional capacity for what's basically a short-term need, which then turns into a global glut, and prices of services and manufacturing dropping. So that's definitely something to watch out for. And the other thing is whether or not there's going to be a drive of new areas where economies of scale are going to again drive consolidation within fragmented industries.
Okay. So from an inflation perspective, it seems like a more complicated story because there are elements that are pulling towards higher inflation, but also elements pulling towards potentially low inflation going down the line.
Look, I think you're right, but you've got to think of this in terms of the time horizon. So, I think in the short term, we should expect to see costs come back down for things like transportation as oil prices come back under control. In the midterm, you've got the impact of the increasing capacity, increasing working capital, increasing investment that's going to find its way to product cost as companies actually increase costs as the companies try and recover those investments. And then in the long term, if we really do go into a boom bust cycle, we could have it flip flop and find ourselves actually with some reduced costs.
Right, and thus inflation coming back under control and maybe to going the other way. Okay, well, it will be definitely uncertain, and we will live to see. Hillel West, that's been really educational, informative, and insightful. So thank you very, very much for being on the podcast.
Hey, Darren, thanks very much. Thanks for the opportunity.
Okay, and for all of you out there, thanks for listening and watching, and watch out for new episodes coming soon. Bye-bye.